Hello and welcome back to Onward podcast. This is Brett, and we're back with another episode today. Today, I'm kind of going pretty big on this bird flu thing. I don't know why, but people have sort of said, "Oh, it's fear-mongering, and why are you talking about this? And the pandemic's in the past, and we got to look to better times, and 100% we should look to better times." But you have to remember that. The World Health Organization, our government officials, public health agencies, they keep saying repeatedly over and over and over again that the next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. And so I think that when I hear those words, we do have to take what they're saying seriously. And if you haven't listened to my previous podcast with Karen Kingston, which is basically called, Breaking a Bird Flu Update, I would encourage you to listen to that because it lays out pretty well what's coming down the road here, coming up this winter. But all that to say, I wanted to bring up a guest that I was recently introduced to, who is the author, together with Dr. Joseph Mercola, who many of you might know, a book called The Great Bird Flu Hoax. And so I think it's very fitting that we got introduced very recently. And so we hopped on the phone and I said, "Hey, what's going on? What's it all about? And let's get you on the show ASAP." So I'll formally introduce Pam. Pam Killeen is a health coach, author, and advocate for circadian health. I love it. With almost 4 decades of experience in the wellness field, her career has evolved from focusing on nutrition and natural health strategies to integrating the critical principles of circadian biology into her online practice. She's the author of 3 books. So as we said, The Great Bird Flu Hoax, that was co-authored with Dr. Joseph Mercola. Addiction, The Hidden Epidemic, also true. And Survival of the Unfittest, which highlights her deep interest in nutrition. So reflecting on her work, she wishes she had included information about circadian practices in her writing and consultations, but believes it's never too late to start. So you can check her out, check the links out below, but also you can go to Pam Killeen, so that's KILLEEN.com, and you can check out some of her work. So Pam, welcome to the show. Great to have you here. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I think, again, we recently got introduced and we jumped on the phone quick. And so just chit-chatting, I've done podcasts and I heard you say this on a couple of other shows. I know that there's this big debate going on right now about do viruses exist and what exactly are we looking at under a microscope and all that sort of stuff. And I've entertained those conversations and I've looked at it. But I think what I would like to do today is sort of push some of that aside and just sort of say, look, you wrote this book with Dr. Mercola. This book is 18 years old. Do I have that right? Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So 18 years ago, you wrote a book called The Great Bird Flu Hoax. Like, what was happening at that time? Like, what prompted you to write the book in the first place?
Oh, great question. I was friends with Dr. Maywan Ho and Professor Joe Cummins, who were part of an international group of scientists called the Institute of Science and Society. And Dr. Maywan Ho had written an article called The Bird Flu Hoax. So Joe and I had to come up with a different title, which ended up being The Great Bird Flu Hoax, because Dr. Maywan Ho had the name first. Nevertheless, one of their big areas of research is in sustainable agriculture. And they taught me a lot about what's going on with the state of our farming and agriculture today. And so I was very concerned about our food supply and the ramifications of this so-called epidemic or pandemic that was allegedly happening back in 2005 and 2006. So I had written an article about it, basically saying, everybody calm down. There's an agenda behind all of this. And I have some very credible scientists that are also screaming from the rooftops, warning people that this is an unnecessary fear-mongering campaign. So at any rate, I guess Joe was following some of my writings. And one day I got this phone call. And he was at LAX. He called me and he said, "Do you want to write an article about the bird flu hoax?" And of course, I couldn't say no because it was a subject I was already very passionate about. At any rate, so we wrote the book, and actually it was on the New York Times bestseller list back in, I think, September of 2006. So people were hungry for this information because I think a lot of people understood that there was something really, really wrong with what was going on. This was a problem that was happening at the factory farms, basically at the level of the factory farms. where, birds were dying in droves. They were being killed or culled because so many of them were so sick. But when I would talk to farmers, of course, even here in Canada or the United States, it's not talked about. But because of the unhygienic, unsustainable practices in these factory farms, it was very relatively common, actually, according to the farmers I spoke to, where these chickens were getting so sick that they would actually have to cull the entire lot of them. And of course, the media doesn't tell us these stories. But the concern around this happening, of course, is if there is going to be some kind of problem with our food supply, it's going to be stemming from these very unhygienic, unsanitary conditions in these factory farms. And as you may know, the H5N1 didn't transmit human to human. There was really no evidence of that happening back in 2005, 2006. The people that did get sick, that did potentially die from some kind of infection, they might have been out playing with a sick bird, or they might have been exposed to sick birds in these very unhealthy factory farms. So really, the chance of transmission back then is probably the same as the chance of transmission today, very, very slight. Yeah. And if you've had a chance to look at some of my other work, it's really about your terrain. How are you treating your body? What are you doing to keep your immune system strong? Because, Brett, you know this, we all have all sorts of bugs in us right now. Do they manifest necessarily? No. But they will manifest if I wear my body down, if I'm not sleeping right, if I'm over exercising, if I'm smelling an environment in cold, dank environment where the air is really poor quality, if I'm around mold, if I'm around chemicals, all of these things are going to wear my body down and something might manifest. So if I get tested for an alleged bug, that bug isn't necessarily causing my illness. So people have to be more discerning today. And I think that's one of the major messages that can come out of these kinds of fear-mongering campaigns.
Yeah. Well, just to back up a step, first of all, the fact that the book made it onto the best sellers list is phenomenal, because that would not happen today. That's for sure. I think if you just go back in time, like, there wasn't the censorship that we have now. There wasn't the sort of like the climate back then was nothing like it is now. I mean, we've just come through a supposed pandemic. And so, of course, everyone is like, on hyper alert kind of thing. And we're all sort of primed to react to that word, I guess. But back then, that was not a big thing. I mean, I remember when it was the first SARS outbreak, I think it was in like 2003. It was, I had just come to Canada at that time. And, they had a giant concert with like 500,000 people to raise funds. I mean, so certainly not 6 feet apart, that's for sure. And that's what happened on the day. Rolling Stones and AC/DC came out and everyone had a giant party. And, here we are today with very, very different messaging around that. But all that to say, you mentioned the chickens and the factory farming and all that sort of thing. And I'm curious to know, at that time, with these birds you say were actually dying, so they were actually getting sick and they were actually dying. We don't know what they were dying from, I guess. I mean, just because they tested positive, does that say that they were dying because of that thing? Or could they have been dying because, I don't know, because they were surrounded by, their own feces and all sorts of other stuff, no sunlight and whatnot. So I guess that's something to sort of perhaps put on the table. Like, do we know that? Like, what were they saying back then?
Well, they were trying to blame a virus, but it could have been anything making them sick. It could have been bacteria, parasite. The sky's the limit. They're living in filthy environments. And when you're living in filthy environments, you're going to increase your chances of getting sick. I mean, Florence Nightingale knew this in the 1850s. Yeah. And so what did she do? She reformed the hospitals. She put in lots and lots of windows and made sure that they were well aerated. And so we know through her work that we have to make sure we're living in a clean environment. And we might do that for ourselves in our homes, but certainly they're not doing that in the factory farms where they have thousands and thousands of animals under one roof. And so consumers are actually in their own way fighting back by voting with their dollars and saying, we want to buy our food from sustainable small family farms. And these are basically what the food industry don't want. They don't want people spending their money on local agriculture. So with this new campaign, I think we have to be very, very careful to make sure that they don't target these wonderful stewards of the land. And that's what they were doing back in 2006. So they would blame migratory birds for carrying this alleged virus when these migratory birds are getting fresh air and sunshine and are magnificently healthy. And so this was the same case with the farmers who had small flocks in their backyard or on their farm. These animals were really, really healthy, but the CFIA and other branches of the government wanted to get rid of them and target them as being the cause of this alleged bird flu pandemic. And they were the innocent victims. They were not the vectors. They were the victims of that fear-mongering campaign. And they could do this again, Brett. And this could be something that would be very, very dangerous again. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, just some of the work I've done recently, I think it is happening again. We've seen this rhetoric, just sort of, I think just to zoom out for a minute, the bird flu campaign, let's call it that, has actually been going on since April of 2022, and perhaps even prior to that. So I think there's been quite a long run up to get us to where we are today. But if you sort of like paid attention and you just saw along the way, they sort of started seeding this narrative, where it's like, hey, like we hear backyard chickens are really bad for climate change, and home gardeners emit more carbon emissions than, these types of things, like to really demonize like growing your own food or this small homesteader type of lifestyle, they've really gone after that. And I think that, I want to come back to this idea that the chickens were sick and they got tested, et cetera. And I think that, as we've sort of sketched out, I'm pretty sure they didn't die from the flu. But what's happening now is that you have health officials that are openly calling for and doing, they're running around and testing everything under the sun. And so, I question how many of the birds that have been culled around the world, millions of birds, how many of them are actually sick with, like, in terms of being symptomatic, and they were culled because they were actually sick, or how many of them simply tested positive and were killed because they tested positive. And then as a precaution, we're also going to take out the neighboring farms as well, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I think that's, so far as I can tell, that's what's happening right now. So we don't even have symptoms. We're just saying because of tests, we're going to wipe them all out. And,
Yeah, so that can happen for sure. That did happen during that time, because I did talk to some farmers who told me their animals were perfectly healthy and yet they were called murdered, whatever you want to call it. But it's into the millions potentially. This happens quite regularly. And again, consumers don't know it's happening. So what makes all of these other times when they're culling these birds any different than now? It's just something that happens. And whether it's because of quotas or controlling the food supply, keeping the numbers of chicken down, if there's too much chicken in the stores, whatever their reasons, I don't know. But when they transfer that information to humans and scare us over it unnecessarily, then it becomes a bigger picture. Is it to sell us more vaccines? Is it to discourage us from buying from small family farms and only centralize the food system? There are potentially many theories going on here. Fear sells, obviously, so it's stimulating to the economy when we're afraid. And this has been a tactic that's been going on since propagandists have been around, like Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays. They've mastered the art of scaring us so that we buy things. And these things are not necessarily healthy. I mean, if you look at Edward Bernays, what did he do? He platformed off the cigarette campaign. How do you sell people something that they don't need that's potentially harmful for you? And they took that template and they basically transferred it to so many other products that they've been selling us for 100 years. There's just nothing new under the sun that's happening here.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, you mentioned human-to-human transmission wasn't happening. And I'm curious, again, we're getting into the weeds here because we don't really know. And also from a technical standpoint, we now have the first case. The language they use, by the way, is something else. The first presumptive case of bird flu in Canada. Someone tested positive, basically. And, so again, I question now, did that person contract something? Did they actually sort of catch something? Did they just get sick and test positive? Like, are they actually sick? Like, I don't know any of those things because the news report doesn't really say anything. They simply say they tested positive and they're at some sick kids hospital, and there you go. But the rhetoric around that is simply, this is the first of the cases, and cases are on the rise. And it's sort of like, well, hang on a second. If you go and listen to my previous podcast, you can listen to the CDC, the WHO, NIH, FDA. I've got leaked footage from Public Health Agency of Canada as well. And these guys are all talking about their vaccine campaign. The interphase, the pre-phase, and then, pre-inter, and then the post-phase of the pandemic. These are how we're going to roll out the shots. This is how we're going to swap them out. So, you have to wonder, if I put on my tinfoil hat for a minute, you have to wonder if this is not being fabricated in an effort to push vaccines on the population. And of course, by extension, the animals as well, of course, So
yeah, to centralize the food supply. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, no question. When they were announcing COVID, I remember it was somewhere mid-March 2020, and the 6 o'clock news was on, and I was in the kitchen, and I could hear an announcement that an 85-year-old man died of this alleged virus in British Columbia. And I practically dropped everything that I had because I knew what was coming. And I thought to myself, I'm sorry this guy's died. I'm sorry he is no longer with us. It's really tragic. I'm not minimizing that. But this was a lead story. So I knew what they were doing. And so they used this 85-year-old guy to deliver this message across Canada and scare us. And now they're using a young child.
Yeah.
And so at this time of the year, Brett, it's very, very common to get sick with some kind of infection because you're not out in the sun. 93% of our time is indoors. So we're not in the sun enough to actually build an immune system. And so when the weather starts turning and you're inside even more, it's dangerous to the immune system. So infections will surface, will come to the fore. And that's why you see so many people getting sick in the fall and in the winter, especially if they haven't been outside that much all summer. And the research, shows very clearly the more you're outside in the sun in the summer, the less likely you're going to get sick in the fall and the winter. And it has more to do than building your vitamin D, but that's definitely a big part of it. Taking vitamin D supplements isn't going to replace the benefits of your going out in the sun, by the way. So
Sure.
we really do need to get that contact with the sun. And these children today, unfortunately, are glued to their screens and they're not necessarily outside moving, getting fresh air and sunshine. And another very frightening thing that happened with COVID that I don't know a lot of people really understand or realize is that what they did was they knew they were going to increase rates of infection by scaring people to be inside, taking us further away from the sun and the fresh air. So rates of infections were ultimately going to keep increasing just because of that dynamic where we were forced to think we were safer inside our homes, when really the opposite is true.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, let's open that discussion up to just a general discussion on terrain-based, the whole terrain-based model of health. And you've just pulled one particular thread out there, but look at poor diet, look at the stress load of people, look how the toxicity of people, EMF radiation. The list goes on and on and on. So there's no shortage of studies to show, as one example, increased cortisol levels and high stress suppresses your immune system, particularly things like secretory IgA. So that's an inverse relationship. You can repeat that with saliva testing over and over and over again. So I think the point is that it's very short-sighted or perhaps disingenuous to say this thing is the reason why you're sick, where it's like, well, actually, you got all these other things that we should be talking about as well, but they don't want to do that. They never want to do that. And to bring us back onto the current bird flu situation, it's pretty much the same thing. You mentioned factory farming. And so, if you look at factory farming, you look at the conditions that they're living in, and what is the terrain of those animals like? Not very good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Not very good. They also don't see the sun. They're also confined. I don't know what kind of feed they're feeding, but let's just say they're living a very suboptimal type of life. So I think that it's no surprise that just like people, when they're stressed out, nutrient deficient, etc., they're also going to get sick. And I think that what I've covered so far is using PCR testing that has ramped up cycle thresholds and all these types of things, and actively going out into the environment and testing everything under the sun. We're bound to find something. Public health said that. They were like, we were going to find stuff. And so what they're saying is, well, we're testing positive, and, well, you might not be sick, but as a precaution, we should probably kill all these animals. And as a precaution, we should probably roll out all these vaccines. Meanwhile, there's not really anything going on, But I want to come back to this human-to-human transmission, if I can. because I think it's important now, today. But back then, was there just no evidence whatsoever that there was human-to-human transmission? Like the literature just said this is impossible?
No, it didn't happen. I remember one case, and that's it, where I think
Did they say it was happening?
Or a father was no, just one case. Like it didn't happen.
Okay.
And it was somebody who was really close to the sick individual, and they were with that person a lot. But again, I don't know the other circumstances. Was it a healthy environment at the house, or was there mold involved? I don't know. But I mean, really, just one case came across our screen that talked about potential for human-to-human transmission, but we didn't have all the facts. So, bottom line is they were saying there really was little to no evidence of any human-to-human contact.
Yeah. Well, and I think now as well, like, people that pay attention, you'll see they don't just sort of take you from position 0 to 100% full throttle. They always got to walk you there. So it's like, well, there might be a chance one day that it could jump from animals to humans, but, right now it's not going to do it. Then lo and behold, oh my gosh, look, we've got one case, Then next thing it's going to be...
Do you remember the studies? But do you remember the studies during the alleged Spanish flu where they were swapping spit? So somebody who allegedly had the Spanish flu, they were swapping, they were breathing face to face with somebody who was very healthy, and nothing, it didn't spread. It didn't spread.
Right.
So there's a definite flaw with the contagion theory. And this was the big debate in the 1800s under Louis Pasteur and Antoine Béchamp. This still holds true today. And so people need to be aware that there's some serious questions over the contagion theory. And
100%.
Yet I know a lot of people hold on to that theory like a dog to the bone, like they just don't want to let go of it, because I think there's something in the human psyche that wants to be afraid, that loves being afraid. I mean, look at all the horror movies we have on out there. People go to them. I don't understand it, but they do it. And so there's a certain element where people do somehow or another attract to feeling afraid.
Yeah. And I mean, look, I get it. We're all a product of our environment, of our education, et cetera. And so a lot of, when you get told something over and over and over again over many generations, that becomes truth. And it's very difficult to sort of snap out of that and then go, oh, hang on, like, let's challenge that. And I think that's what people are doing. I've had Jamie Andrews on my show to discuss that. I've interviewed Dr. Tom Cowan on my previous show about the contagion myth. So I've definitely explored that. And I think, it's interesting to explore because it's very, very different from what we're told. And I think that the reason why I'm finding it interesting to have that discussion is because when you plug that into the environment that we're in now, that environment is built exclusively on the germ theory. And it basically says the only reason why you're going to get sick is because of this big bad virus. And the only thing you can do to protect yourself is take vaccines and antivirals, and that's it. And the other thing we can do is we have to kill all the animals as a precaution. So, when you boil it down to that level, there's a whole nother set of questions that pop up, which is why.
Right. And and so when you look 100 years ago, Brett, we had open air schools. We had open air hospitals. They knew, the Nobel Prize in 1903 went to Niels Finsen for using sunlight therapy because they knew the medicinal value of the sun. And so people would go to the sanitaria and they would go and they would lie out in the sun and basically expose as much of their skin as possible to the sun because they knew about the healing benefits of the sun, not just for things like rickets, but for infectious diseases as well. And so they would use these sun baths, if you will, these sun spas, if you want to call them that, for places for people to go for prevention and for curing people with these serious conditions. And it was acknowledged even through the 1920s and so on, even the 1930s to a certain extent. But once antibiotics hit the market, all these sun therapies went away. They went away. Yeah. But we had this wisdom 100 years ago. So when you have a sustainable farmer and they put their chickens outside and they put their cows outside, they have wonderful immune systems. They're very, very healthy animals. What do humans do? We hide in our homes 93% of our time inside the house when we could be outside getting as much fresh air and sunshine as we possibly can to help boost our immune systems, to protect us from whatever organisms are out there or even already burrowed inside of us. Because a lot of these organisms are already in us. Like if I remember when my health collapsed, I was exposed to black mold. and I had a strep infection in my throat that would reoccur, at certain times of the year, like in January, for example, I would get this recurring strep infection. So it was already inside of me. But by January, of course, my vitamin D stores, I didn't know it at the time, but my vitamin D stores would have gone down and it would have made me more susceptible. So the strep would surface in January and I'd have a few days where I could hardly talk because my throat was so sore. So I didn't catch anything, Brett. It was already there.
Yeah. Well, and then that's sort of, again, drilling down into the sort of core tenets of terrain-based, this whole terrain-based theory of health, right? Which is actually the origins of homeopathic medicine, of naturopathic medicine, et cetera, et cetera. But, we don't need to get into that today because that was all sort of systematically shut down and suppressed over the years in favor of a more pharmaceutical type of model, But, speaking of past and present, since you wrote your book 18 years ago and you look at what's going on today, do you feel that anything has changed at all? Like, are you seeing the same kind of thing happening back then as we're seeing now, or are there differences? Or I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Very similar. I think their agendas are very similar as well. Whether or not consumers are going to push back is a whole other question. Because I said, I know a lot of people who still really believe COVID was real. I'm not saying anybody didn't get sick. People got sick, but that's normal. That's what happens to humans. We get sick in the winter. And sometimes it's more serious than others. But whatever their agenda is, whether they're using vaccines to bring down the birth rate, we know that, I talked to nurses and doctors from India, Africa, and they know that they put things like HCG in the vaccines to slow down the birth rate in those countries. And it's not just them telling me this, it's in the literature, it's even in the media. What else could they possibly be doing with these vaccines? Whenever a new vaccine comes out in my town, I hear it on the news, there's a new vaccine, a new booster, something coming out. And the number of sirens that I hear in a day goes up at least threefold. So on a regular day where I live in London, Ontario, I might hear 3 sirens a day. When a new vaccine comes out, I hear 9 or more sirens a day. So something is really, really wrong with this picture. When during the outbreak of COVID, I would hear 3 sirens a day. Same thing, nothing different, right? But once the vaccine came out, poof, all of a sudden there's 9 or more sirens a day. So I don't understand why. I only talked to one person that I know who noticed this, and he said to me, Pam, he says, I live right near University Hospital, and the number of sirens I hear has gone up dramatically. And he texted me this morning, and he said, and within a matter of 10 minutes, he heard 3 sirens. He said, it's just getting out of control, but it only happens after they announce the release of a vaccine. So whatever their agenda is, Brett,
we can speculate.
Yeah, it's all speculation. I have a friend who works at an old age home here in London, and she told me, she said, as soon as the vaccines come out, there's more people who are dying. When I wrote the Great Bird Flu Hoax back in 2006 with Dr. Mercola, I was at a health fair here in London, and a woman came up to me who works at a really big old age home here in London, and she whispered in my ear, and she said, you're right, Pam. She said, once those vaccines come out, the death rate goes up at the home.
Were they vaccinating people back then for bird flu?
Back when you wrote this book? The seasonal flu. When the book came out, they didn't get aggressive with the vaccine as much as what they did now.
Like now. Yeah.
So, what they did with COVID. So, yes, they were aggressive with the H5N1 vaccine, but nowhere near as bad as what they did with COVID. But this woman was talking to me about just the regular seasonal flu and how the death rate would go up after they would get the seasonal flu vaccine.
Yeah. Well, and I've spoken at length about all of that, the flu vaccine, again, on my previous show with Jeremy Hammond, and he's got all the data and everything. And you just look at the efficacy, and it's like maximum on a good year, 40% if you want to be, charitable. But if you really get into the numbers, it's actually like negative 9% or something like that. There's really not a net benefit at all. It's really a net negative. But suffice to say, look, we're preaching to the choir, you and and I think the thing I can't stress enough to people is what is absolutely incredible nowadays is no matter what the problem is, right? So you pick a problem. Let's say we've got, and let's just play the game, and we say, oh, we've got an infection. Okay, we got some virus on the loose. Okay, or we've got a climate change problem, or we've got too much CO2, or whatever that problem is. It's interesting how it's always a technocratic or a pharmaceutical solution, right? There's no solution that just says, hey, man, here's 10 things you can do right now to strengthen your immune system. If you just lost 10 pounds, if you upped your vitamin D, if you took daily vitamin C, if you did there's so many things you can do, and yet we still hear that on mainstream channels. You cannot even talk about it, because it's almost like hearsay, or it's mind-boggling. But these new off-the-shelf vaccines with very dubious safety testing, these are good. Like, these will be the thing that will protect you. So it's very crazy to me that you still can't have these conversations.
Right, and that brings me to the point of what a waste of money this whole vaccine thing has been. To me, it's just so blatantly obvious. It's staring right at us. We have spent billions, if not trillions of dollars on this initiative for decades now. And under the auspices that this is supposed to be making us healthy, these vaccine initiatives are supposed to be making us healthy. Now, about 80% of us will die from some kind of chronic illness. And that means our quality of life will be compromised for potentially decades before we pass away. Mm-hmm. And then you look at infectious disease, and about 6.7% of us will die from infectious disease. Yet, very little attention is paid on the chronic illnesses.
Exactly.
And they're causing more grief, more pain. I mean, I'm sorry for everybody who does die from an infectious disease. I'm sorry about that. And it is tragic. But when you're immunocompromised, when you get to a certain age, what have you, a lot of the individuals are going to pass away. But the real problem, the real expenditure happens with chronic disease. And
correct.
You're not hearing about that when you're hearing about things like the bird flu. And it's taking up so much of the news, and nobody's talking about solutions. And yet there are really tangible, viable solutions for our health, how to improve our health.
Yeah.
But it doesn't get talked about.
No, and this is just it. You hit the nail on the head. It's and I think the reason why that doesn't happen is, one, I'm not so convinced that they're actually looking to create a healthy, vibrant, vital society, first of all. Okay. Second of all, if you suffer, as the population does, from lifestyle diseases, which is really what those are, which are nutrition related, which are lifestyle related, etc., there's no drugs that fix lifestyle diseases. Okay. I don't care what people say about Ozempic. All right. So the problem is that you have an allopathic system that is ill-equipped to deal with chronic degenerative disease, except for managing symptoms, right? And so, as we said, the cure for chronic degenerative disease is actually more through restoration and through improving the functioning of your body, right? Through getting you well. And that's just not the way the medical model works. That's not the medical model is a reactionary model. It was born out of infectious disease, broken legs, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're trying to use the same line of thinking and mapping that onto chronic degenerative disease caused by lifestyle issues, So, you're absolutely correct. And, what a crazy time we find ourselves in, because people are not getting healthier. That's for sure. You can see it.
No, but I had a unique perspective on our healthcare system during the lockdowns, because I was taking care of my elderly parents who they've passed away. And so I was in the hospitals quite a bit during the lockdowns, and they were deserts. You're hearing on the media, everything is just overflowing, and all these people are in the hospitals. And I would go to the hospitals with my father, who was still alive at the time, and I'd be looking around going, like, there's hardly anybody here. Like, what's going on here? The media's giving a totally different story. So they're very clever at manipulating the media. They're very clever at putting up press releases, and the talking heads basically just spew out whatever the press releases say, and that's essentially the fake news that we're being bombarded with through mainstream media. And so we have to be far more discerning to understand, when you see mainstream media and you see advertisements, they're beholden. They are beholden to those advertisers. And when you have loans and you have a mortgage and you have alimony and you've got all these things to pay out and you're a doctor or you're a scientist, you're going to do what you're told to do because you have loans that you have to pay back. And so you don't question anything. So when I've been told by staff at senior homes that if I tell you this, I'm going to whisper it in your ear, but I can't tell anybody else because I'm going to lose my job if I tell you. So there's a lot of people out there who know the truth, who understand how dysfunctional this whole fear-mongering frenzy is, but they won't say anything because they're afraid to lose their jobs. And so they basically know exactly what they're doing. They have society and certain members of staff members in certain segments of the population where they could be whistleblowers, but whistleblowing, doesn't pay. So
not at all. Quite the
floor,
Yeah, quite the contrary, actually. It doesn't pay at all. And look, I think that what I've said on the show before and a lot of the work I've done, like we are entering into the age of pandemics in a sense, but also what has been built is a pandemic industry, right? That's what's being built. Like that's what the IHR amendments are. That's what the pandemic treaty and agreement's all about. Like that's what the One Health initiative is all about. It's all geared up towards that. You know what I mean? So it shouldn't be a surprise that we are very close to another pandemic. I think some of us were actually thinking it was going to happen a lot sooner. Some people were looking at Mpox. Some people were looking at Marburg coming out of Rwanda. So, if you pay attention, you can kind of see they're sort of speaking about a lot of these different things. But, all that to say, I'm certainly having these conversations with people like you just to make other people aware that some of these things are not new things. Some of these tricks and tactics have been well trodden. These roads are well trodden, and so hopefully, if and when this does rear its head fully, more people will be awake and aware as to what the heck is actually going on. That's my hope.
And thanks to shows like yours, I really have also seen a lot of disillusioned people who really had thought that our system was effective and really revered their doctors and so on and so forth. And in the last couple of years, I see a switch happening where they're starting to say there's something really wrong with this system, this healthcare system. So essentially, and it's being orchestrated, I do believe. So what is going on, Brett, is that we are moving away from healthcare to self-care. And they're not telling people, they're showing people that this is what has to happen. So thankfully for shows like yours and what you do for a living and so on, is that people can migrate to more of a self-care model. This has been something that has been gradually happening, but it really has exploded especially the last couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. And I've been saying that for many years, as someone who coaches practitioners and clinicians and the work that I do, I've been saying for years, there's a fundamental paradigm shift in the whole way that we view healthcare and health and disease, and more people are waking up to that. I mean, that's why, you look at the functional medicine space, you look at the nutrition space, the health coaching space, it's blown up over the last 5 to 10 years, even before the pandemic. And I think what the silver lining of the pandemic was really that it opened people's eyes up to a completely different way of viewing health and disease, and I think that when you have health authorities, public health agencies, I'm stressing the health here, that are not actually recommending any tools to improve your health whatsoever, that right there was a real red flag for average Joe in the street. It's like, why can't we talk about all these other things? Yeah.
Public health's reason, starting public health was for population control, right? So that was the raison d'etre. That's why they started, right? So.
Well, Pam, thank you so much for joining me today. And I know short notice, we kind of drummed this up last minute. So great to meet you and great to hang out with you and chat with you for a little bit. For those of you listening, just a reminder, you should pick up Pam's book. It's one for the coffee table, maybe one for Christmas time. You can just leave it on the coffee table and just see what happens, right? But that's called The Great Bird Flu Hoax. And again, if you want to go to Pam's website, that is Pam Killeen, so KILLEEN.com. So grab the book, check out some of the work that she's doing. And thanks so much, Pam, for joining me today.
Thank you, Brett.
And for those of you listening, watching, you know what to do, right? So share this episode. If you have comments, leave it below on Substack, so onwardpod.substack.com, and check the show notes for any other additional resources. We will catch up with you next time.